That might be interesting too.
Hello, I would like to welcome you to today's TechNet webcast, Planning for and Deploying Office SharePoint Server 2007. This is part 2 of 2. For more Microsoft webcasts, go to microsoft.com/webcasts. I would now like to introduce today's presenter, Kevin Remdy. A prolific blogger, Kevin Remdy shares his thoughts, ideas, and tips on the TechNet Events blogger's website, and you've got his blog right down there at the bottom of the slide. You can go check that out. As a webcast presenter, Kevin has landed on the Microsoft Top 10 webcast list several times. Kevin has worked as both developer and an IT professional, so he loves sharing helpful new solutions and technologies with his IT peers. Kevin, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Eric. Well, greetings and welcome once again to part 2 now of our 2-part series on planning for and deploying Office SharePoint Server 2007. As Eric said, my name is Kevin Remdy, and I'm an IT pro evangelist, part of the Microsoft Across America team at Microsoft. I also like to point out not only my blog address, but also my email address on this first page here. I want you to be able to use those as a resource should you have any additional questions after the webcast. And I have, in fact, posted a resource page on my blog. If those of you that have noticed, it's the same resource page that I posted for part 1. I reposted for part 2 because it includes all of the related links and information about SharePoint Server, Office SharePoint Server, and the deployment topics that we're talking about in this series. So great to have you with us again. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into it. So in this session, we're going to be covering, again, this is part 2 of a 2-part series. And the first part, we gave you a really good overview of the planning and deployment options. And we're going to briefly review some of those today also. But then we'll spend more time on some of the advanced settings. I'm going to give you some scripting tips and some other initial considerations. Now, you might choose to deploy SharePoint as either a standalone server, perhaps maybe in a server farm topology. And if you're deploying a farm topology, you're going to want to consider whether you'll use web load balancing. So I'm going to describe what load balancing is and why you would want to use it. There are also some other configuration settings, things such as authentication, that you'll want to determine before you deploy SharePoint. Now, once you've figured out your topology and your deployment schedule, you'll have some operational tasks to perform, things such as configuring single sign-on if you choose to use that functionality. Along with security, you'll want to plan for disaster recovery and make a strategy for that. So we're going to discuss some ways that you can perform that today. Ways such as the basic recycle bin that it's part of now SharePoint services, but also all the way up to the SharePoint backup and restore utility. And even we'll even discuss briefly the SQL Server backup and restore functionality. Now, as most of our TechNet sessions, we also like to point out some helpful experience, some things that hopefully you've had some experience in prior to viewing this webcast so that you'll be able to get the most out of this webcast. So certainly some experience with SharePoint services in previous versions. Office SharePoint Portal Server, of course, really being what has now become Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007 in this latest version. Windows Server 2003 administration would be beneficial. And I'd like to add a fourth one here to this list also, and that is I hope that you have watched part 1 of this 2-part session. Part 1 was a really good introduction on many of the topics that we're going to be diving into greater detail about here. So I highly recommend that you view it sometime. So here's our agenda today, and the first thing we're going to talk about is some of the initial considerations for deploying a farm. Now, as I said, this is kind of a review of what we talked about last week. In last part, part 1, we talked about deployment. We talked about a number of deployment options. So, of course, the first thing you'd have to consider, you have to have a good handle on, is what are the needs of your business? What then is SharePoint Server going to be able to address for your business? So at a minimum, you should have an understanding of your users, the content that they manage, the expected usage of such an application, and you also might want to consider data composition, user load, long-running operations, performance, availability, reliability concerns, any other network considerations. And when you're deploying SharePoint 2007, you also need to make sure to create the right size topology for your organization. Now, we have small topologies, as we talked about in part 1. We have a single server deployment where you have a single server with all the necessary components to run SharePoint services. But you may then choose to create a farm topology where you divide roles among more than one server. And so as your performance needs increase, you'll want to increase then the size of your farm to allow for that and to take advantage of better performing and distributed services. So you also have actually the ability to create more than one farm. You can actually manage a multi-farm topology. And the advantage of this might be security or process isolation, or maybe you have the need to do this due to business demands or politics. And the final consideration has to do with preparing your servers then for the final deployment. So depending on the topology you've chosen, you're going to need to prepare the servers to meet that topology's requirements. So your application servers, they should have either Windows Server 2003 or, when it's available, the Windows Server currently codenamed Longhorn, the next version. If you have a separate database server, you'll want to make sure that your SQL Server version is also up to date. Now, by identifying your setup and by using scripts, you can actually simplify your setup process. Now, first thing you want to do is identify whether you're going to be doing a basic or an advanced setup. What I mean by basic setup is, in this case, we're talking about a single server situation. And a server farm, then, is the more advanced deployment. So when setting up your deployment, you can determine whether you'll have a single web front-end server or a complete web server farm setup. Now, once you've made that determination, then there are scripts that can help you simplify the process. And there are executables that can help you with your scripts. For example, setup.exe, of course. This puts the binaries on the computer. It does the installation. It also configures a file called config.xml. The psconfig.exe is used to enable SharePoint services. And then the stsadmin, or the stsadm.exe, this configures SharePoint services and creates shared services and sites. We also have a unified user interface. This is where you're going to be doing most of your administration. The beauty of this is it's a consistent experience, and it also allows for easy expansion. So the site master page supplies the context of the page. And then Microsoft actually recommends that you don't change the site master page. Using the same site master page allows for consistent branding, consistent user interface across all of the sites in your site collection. Now, you might decide to change the master page in subsites of the site hierarchy in order to change branding there. So maybe for your company has different subsites for each different product or brand that they support. So in that case, you might want to have a master page for those subsites that reflects those different brands. Now, most organizations are going to require some redundancy at the front end, or the WFE, the web front end tier. And there's times when you should do and consider then a three-tier or a three-server farm, with one server running the role of the web front end. And then in order to decide if your organization requires that redundancy at the web front end, you need to ask the following questions. First of all, is availability a big requirement? Is it a problem if your ability is below 99%? What about your data? Is the availability of your data a critical issue? Can your organization tolerate any temporary loss or access to the data? Now, if you can tolerate some temporary loss, then that's okay. A multi-tiered or a multi-layered web front end is not necessarily going to be a problem. But if the answer to any of those questions is yes, well, then you really should consider using web load balancing. Now, if you decide to do that, then of course the next step is to decide which load balancing technology you're going to use. Now, Windows SharePoint Services version 3 does support two methods of load balancing. The first one is software load balancing. You can use network load balancing, or NLB, services that are in Windows Server 2003. It's built in. NLB actually runs on your web front-end servers, and it uses TCP/IP to route requests. Now, because NLB runs on the front-end servers, it does use some front-end web server resources. You need to be aware of that. But typically, the impact on the system resources is pretty small. It's a software solution, and it can handle as many as 32 front-end web servers. Now, the second method of load balancing uses hardware, such as a router or a switch box. There's load balancing hardware that's using your network to direct web traffic between your front-end web servers. So, and load balancing hardware works really well, but it is a little bit more expensive to set up than software. And it doesn't use, and the benefit here, of course, is it also doesn't use any of your front-end web server's resources in order to run. Okay, so now that we looked at some of the setup and deployment steps, let's take a look at some deployment configuration considerations. Now, one of the services Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 provides is an object model for allowing you to create and manage incoming and outgoing URLs. Now, this is for cases where we have a reverse proxy server that needs to be implemented between the client computer and the web server that's running Windows SharePoint Services. Now, let me first define what I mean by incoming and outgoing URLs. An incoming URL is the URL of the request when it reaches the web server. It's what the web server sees as having been requested. So Windows SharePoint Services sees this URL, and by examining the application layer of the protocol, and the HTTP protocol in this case, or HTTPS, it looks at the host header of the HTTP packet, and also then the destination port of the TCP packet. So basically, this is the address of the service. It might be www.contoso.com coming in from an external user, or from an internal user. The web server might see the request going to SharePoint Server 2 from an internal server. So that it's requested, and again, someone at a web browser requesting this particular page. So that's the incoming URL. The outgoing URL is the base absolute URL that Windows SharePoint Service uses to link, and in the links that it generates on the page that it returns to the user. So the user is shown a page of links being returned by the SharePoint server, and those links should make sense for access back to additional locations on that web page from the context of the user. So the external user's links would be some page at www.contoso.com, but maybe someone internally would be clicking on links to SharePoint Server 2 or www.fabricam.com. Could be at a completely different address. So if the same SharePoint site is being used for both internal and external access, or other types of access, other different zones is what we call them, well then you're going to need some form of reverse proxy consideration for the sake of this external access. So in such a case, two virtual servers, and this is defined in IIS, but managed by SharePoint Server and the SharePoint Management. We'll actually do this in the demonstration. But these two virtual servers will share the same content. So the same content is being accessed. And then the reverse proxy is going to apply only to the external-facing server. So the internal-facing service is directly accessible by HTTP. The externally-facing server then can be reached only by an SSL request to the reverse proxy server. Advanced extranet support makes it possible for Windows SharePoint Services to use a different protocol, host name, and port number in links it generates on the pages that it returns to the user. So the reverse proxy server receives a request for a particular URL from the client computer. Proxy server then remaps that request to a different URL for the web server running SharePoint. So for example, proxy server might receive a request for fabricam.com, but then it forwards the request to the web server at contoso.com. With the advanced extranet support, SharePoint Services can be customized to return the same original URL base in all the links in its pages that it returns. So it's examining the packets that it's receiving from the proxy server, isolating the protocol, the host name, and the port number, those parts of the request on the incoming URL, and then the SharePoint server actually uses two tables to determine the correct base of the URL to return. So one table maps each incoming URL to a particular zone. So it's internal, extranet, internet, and so on. And the other table maps each zone to a particular outgoing URL. So Windows SharePoint Services then rewrites the URLs shown on its pages using the outbound base URL that it finds through those tables. So these tables actually, you don't have to worry about building these tables. I'll actually show you in the demonstration how easy it is to configure this relationship that SharePoint will support for us. We have 5 zones per virtual server that are available to us. They represent the various ways of accessing a SharePoint site. So internet, intranet, extranet, custom, and default are these 5 zones. And each one of these zones can have any number of incoming URLs. However, each zone can only have one outgoing base URL. So that said, a lot of words on one slide here, but let's go right into our demonstration. I actually want to show you what this means when we configure zones in our SharePoint installation. So I'm going to go into the application sharing here that Eric mentioned earlier. And at this point, it's a good opportunity to hit F5 on your keyboard. F5 is a toggle between full screen and then getting you back into the live meeting interface. So that way you'll have a better chance of seeing most of my screen, if not all of my screen here. I'm running 1024 by 768 on this server, I believe. In fact, let me go ahead and do this. I'll shrink it up just a little bit for you here. All right. Now I'm going to open up the SharePoint administration, and we'll find that under, and I do have a shortcut on my desktop, but I want to show you where it's found. Under Microsoft Office Server, there's our SharePoint 3.0 Central Administration page. And we're given our home page here with our administrative tasks, things that we saw in the previous demonstration. I have a couple of my servers here. Moss is the one that I'm currently on now. Let's go to our Operations tab.
Excuse me, Kevin, I'm
Yes.
seeing a gray screen right now. I think you maybe didn't hit start on the sharing, possibly.
Boy, it looks right to me. Let me go back again.
Okay, sorry about
I'll
that.
come in and out of it again. How's that looking?
I'm still seeing a gray screen. Might just be me.
Well, I'll tell you what. Let me do one more thing. I'll re-add
Sorry about this.
a sharing slide here.
Okay.
Okay, is that looking any better?
I'm still seeing a gray screen. Yeah, and I've got a couple other attendees who are experiencing the same thing. I'm going to pause the recording.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we are back. Apologize for the inconvenience. Go ahead, Kevin.
All right, sorry about that. Yep, sometimes just leaving and coming back in live meetings seems to clean it up. It's the old, well, did you shut down and restart? Yes, I did just now. All right, so let's get back into this then. So I mentioned that I'm in the administration application, and since we didn't see it the first time, let me just show you where that's at. Under the programs, when we installed it, under Office Server, we'll find under SharePoint 3.0 Central Administration. So that's what I launched here to get to my administration application. And I'm right now on the Operations tab. The reason I'm on the Operations tab is because this is going to be where we manage our global configuration. And one of those global configuration changes that I mentioned was being able to work with alternate access mappings. And this has everything to do with what I talked about just previously, the fact that we have outgoing URLs and incoming URLs that we may need to map based on where the access is coming from to our particular web application. So when I click on that, it brings me to the alternate access mappings area. And for this one, let's say I have an application at moss.litware.inc.com. Maybe that's my internal name for this. However, I may want to have additional relationship, maybe with an extranet connection or an extranet relationship with a partner. So I'm going to click on that incoming URL, moss.litware.inc, and we can edit the incoming URL. We can change the zone. In fact, here's what I'm going to do actually. Rather than editing the incoming zone, I'm going to work with the alternate mapping. So I have the ability to add incoming URLs. And for this one, I'm going to be mapping it against this collection, moss.litware.com. We can choose from this as well by choosing an alternate here. But I'm going to be looking at moss.litware.com, and the new default name for this incoming URL, let's say that would be moss, let's make it a full URL, moss.litware.net. And then we would define then what zone this is going to be associated with. So here again, this goes into building this table for the sake of those lookups once a request comes in. So let's say this is associated with the extranet zone. And I'll save. And now notice we have different incoming URLs, one for the default zone, another defined for the extranet zone that maps to then the moss, essentially on the back end, maps to the moss.litwareinc.com. So really easy to set those up based on the different zones that you may be supporting and the different types of access coming into your SharePoint server. Now another thing we need to consider in our initial configuration are security settings. It's important in any deployment scenario. So for that, in this case, I'm really concerned with antivirus. And we actually have antivirus support in SharePoint Server. So let me click on the Operations tab one more time, and down here under Security Configuration, notice I have an antivirus option for me. Now this is going to give me some control over the security on my system. So as long as I have a version of an antivirus product installed on this server that SharePoint that supports SharePoint servers, then I have the ability to work with it and actually say whether or not I want to scan documents on upload or download. Perhaps I want to allow users to download infected documents. Well, no, I don't think I do. I think I'm going to leave that one unchecked. But I may want to attempt to clean infected documents. Maybe depending on network considerations, we have the ability to define how long we want our virus scanner to run before timing out. So we can actually set a timeout period. So if our server response becomes a problem, we might want to set a timeout value different so that we can address that. Similarly with number of threads. When you're performing an antivirus scan, there's a certain number of execution threads that are being used. And we can actually restrict the number of threads that are dedicated at a time to this process. So I'll go ahead and click OK on this one. Another security configuration we have are file types. We actually have the ability to block certain file types from being able to be used or being manipulated or managed through these sites. So by clicking Blocked File Types under Security Settings, a very easy to use list that we can just add to this list as we choose for the types of files that we don't want to support natively in our SharePoint document collections or lists. In fact, we can define it, in this case, globally, as I'm doing now, or I can even specify it by a particular web application. Choose an application, and then generate a separate list just specific to that application. I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of here and go back to the operations page, and we'll go back to the slides for just a minute before we do our next demonstration. Okay. Shared services. We talked about shared services in part 1, but we're going to talk about this a little bit more again. These are high-value, resource-intensive services that we group together. Now, each server farm can have from one to many shared services. Now, just to review a little bit, the goal of shared services is to separate services from portals. So we're removing, and we're actually improving the scalability. We're removing the scale limitation for the number of portals that we're allowed. Well, it also allows shared services to act better together as a group and to be able to manage them in a central way. So another benefit of shared services is that they are inter-farm capable. What I mean by that is they can be shared among more than just one farm. So you can have a set of shared services and a shared service provider that more than one farm can use. But why would we want to do that? Well, again, it's all about optimizing resources. You eliminate the need for redundant services. You also have less impact on the infrastructure when these services need to be changed or updated. So the next question is, well, when would you share services between farms? Well, again, you may do this or not, maybe depending on your organization or your political concerns. Maybe you've dedicated resources for some specific tasks, and so it allows then for better and greater scalability. Now, when you're designing inter-farm shared services, you need to strive for consistency in the configuration, in the security, and in the function. And you also have to consider the security implications, and this involves deciding how to grant administrative access between farms. So the next demonstration here, different topic, but I do want to show you one of the other considerations having to do with content, and in terms of managing the content. We may have content on one site, and as part of a document list, or even part of an entire site, and we decide that we want to deploy that content from one location to another, or we even manage a kind of a replication topology through SharePoint. So we have content that's new on one site. We want to make sure that it is duplicated on another site. And we do that by creating something called deployment paths and deployment jobs. So that's what our next demonstration is. So I'm back on the Operations tab here again, and where we're going to be looking for this is under Content Deployment. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit here. And I'm not hearing anybody yelling at me, so I assume you can see this.
We can see it just
good.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking.
So the first thing we want to do in setting this up is there are some initial content deployment settings that we need to define. And then once we're done with those settings, we can define our actual paths and jobs. So let's go into Content Settings. And whether or not we want to accept deployment jobs, so do we want to accept incoming content jobs to this server? Sure, we want to do that. Then what are the servers that are involved in this case? Well, we're going to say it's this current server, so the MOS server. And the name of this server is MOS, so that is one of the ones that's available. And I'll use that also as a available export server. Do we want to use connection security? Now, certainly by default, it is recommended that you require encryption for these connections, and it'll use HTTPS. Now, that assumes that you've installed a certificate using IIS and into this site or into this web application so that it'll be used. Now, we don't have that, so in this case, just for the sake of the demonstration, I'm not going to require encryption. Temporary file locations and so on, and then number of reports to retain in terms of reporting what's going on there. So those are the initial settings for the sake of content deployment. Now let's scroll down again and actually create a job or a path and then associate a job with this defined path. So this brings us to the Manage Content Deployment Paths and Jobs screen. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new path. So let's click there. And it's going to ask us for the name of a path. Well, we'll just call this one Path to New Site. And give it a description. And we need to choose a source and a destination application and site collection. Now, web application, of course, is as are defined here, so a name or a particular application simply defined by port. I'm going to use my moss.bitrank.com application, and then within that application we have a list then of the site collections that are available. Now currently I only have one site collection, and that is the root, so I'll go ahead and choose that as the source in this path that we're defining. And it fills out the URL here for us too, so we can do a little logic check there. And then the destination central administration web application. So this is where the destination is. Now the destination, we may not have authentication to do that. We may actually have to enter some authenticating information in order to make this connection possible. So the first thing we'll do is enter the URL here. And notice what happens when I enter only HTTP. Notice it says, hey, wait a minute, you might want to secure this. Notice that it notices that we're only using HTTP, so it's not going to use SSL or encryption for securing this traffic. That's okay for our demonstration here. So the application that I'm going to be connecting to is actually on this same server. I'll just enter that here, 42.5.12. And then the authentication information that I mentioned to connect to that destination web application. Now we can use an application pool account or some different account. Now in this case I'm going to go ahead and use my administrator account, since that's on that web application. That account has the rights to work with it. And then notice it asks us to connect. So it's going to do a verification of our authentication before we are even able to choose the destination web application. Notice these are grayed out currently. So I'll click connect. It validates my password and login, and it says connection succeeded. That's good. So now I have the ability to choose then the destination web application. So let me choose this SharePoint 27012 application. Now, this is actually one that I built prior to the webcast today. And we can choose a site collection as the destination. We'll choose the root there as well, as it's the only site collection currently available at that destination web application. I may choose to deploy usernames along with the content being deployed. So that's really up to you whether or not you want to do that. We get more information about that here. And similarly with security information, whether or not ACLs, roles, and memberships are also transferred. Let's go ahead and say OK. And that then will create the path to the new site. Now that's simply a path definition. We haven't actually done anything yet. Notice there is nothing scheduled. It's not been run. Nothing's happening here with this particular path. We do now need to create a job in order to make this happen. So I'm going to create a new job. That also implies that we can actually associate more than one job to a path. So we may have different things happening as working with our different schedules on the same path. So this job is going to have a name. Let's call this one Job for New Site. And let's choose the path. Now this is of course going to choose the path that we just defined, linking it to the new Path to New Site path. And then what's the scope? So this is going to be selecting then the sites that we're going to deploy. Now I can send the entire site collection, or we're going to even specify sites within the site collection if we choose. I can actually enter sites here. And we can select them by clicking the Select Sites button, and actually brings us up a nice little screen where we can drill down into the different sites that are available to us at this application. I'm going to say cancel. We're just going to use the entire collection in this case. And then we need to set up a schedule. We probably would want to set up a frequency or a schedule. And I'm going to run this job on the following schedule. And let's say we could choose every so many minutes, once an hour, or maybe even just once. One time only is even an option. But I'm going to leave this default here just to say once a day I'm going to check to see if there's any new content that needs to be deployed to the new site. Now notice that what I said there was only new content, and that is one of the options that we have here. choosing to only send new or changed or deleted, in this case, making sure that it's deleted on the destination as well, those changes then being replicated. Now, I could choose to replicate all content whenever this schedule fires off. That's another option that we have. So we'll go ahead and just do only the changes as they occur. And then we have the ability to also set up additional notifications. Those are available to us. I'll go ahead and leave those blank. Click OK. And now here's the new job for our site. Now notice here it tells us when's the next run, whether or not it has run ever. We also have the ability to launch it now if we want. So I could actually run it, or I could simply test it. In fact, let's just run a test job here. I'll select Test Job. Notice it updates the status here to preparing. And eventually we're going to see some additional information about whether or not this test run completed successfully. And that will at least give us an indication that we've set up things appropriately for the sake of this content deployment. So I'm going to leave this running here. We're going to go back to the slides for just a minute, and we'll come back to our demos shortly. So we've looked at how to deploy and configure our SharePoint farm and some of the initial configurations. Let's take a look at some additional administrative tasks that we need to perform. Password management. We've greatly simplified password management in SharePoint 2007. A service account credential change has resulted in there no longer being the need for 2 accounts with the password role. Built-in management in SharePoint 2007 allows for secure credential management and updates. There's also a user interface for changing accounts and a command line support also for the password role. Single sign-on, or SSO is sometimes abbreviated. And this is something that's new in SharePoint. SSO with SharePoint allows you to enter one name and password and use it for not only the SharePoint application, but for a variety of applications. SSO even allows for the storage and mapping of credentials when connecting to third-party or back-end systems. That's why it becomes truly a front end for a single sign-on system. So many of your companies have already developed in-house credential storage systems, or perhaps they use a solution other than Microsoft Single Sign-On. So instead of maintaining credential mappings in 2 places, we actually provide now in SharePoint Server 2007 a mechanism called Pluggable SSO. So this allows you to specify an alternate single sign-on provider, alternate from the standard provider that's in Office SharePoint Server 2007. So we'll support single sign-in in SharePoint Server, but if you already have your own sign-in management, we'll allow you to plug that in to SharePoint and use that as the front end for your single sign-on. So the SSO feature in Office SharePoint Server maps your user credentials to back-end data systems as well. So you're using SSO, you can then access data from servers and services that are external to Office SharePoint Server. And from within Office SharePoint Server web parts, you can view, you can create, you can change that data. The SSO feature ensures that credentials are managed securely, that you can enforce user permission levels that are configured on external data sources, and that your users are not prompted to re-enter their credentials when viewing data from external data sources. Remember, it's single sign-on, it's just what it's called. Single-time authentication for the sake of not only SharePoint, but for those back-end applications which you've configured and allowed to be accessed through SharePoint. Now, SSO does require the use of Windows authentication for user accounts. It also can be used in environments where SSO is used to authenticate user accounts only in the current thread invoking SSO APIs. As long as the invoking SSO API has a Windows identity associated with it. The job service in Microsoft Windows SharePoint Services version 3 provides facilities for setting up something called a timed job. Now, these jobs can run either after delaying for a definable interval or during a certain time in the hour, a certain day, a certain week, a certain month, a certain year. The job service also provides a facility for distributing work then among servers in a farm. Now, there's some utilities that you're going to use to manage these timer jobs. The first one is the timer service. The service is called SP Timer. This is a task manager task that coordinates actions across the farm and keeps the farm in sync. The timer jobs themselves, these are the modules of code that are registered with SharePoint, and they update configuration information or they process data. And then finally, there's an administrative service, and it's the SP admin service. This is the one that performs administrative functions needed for timer jobs. This service is only called by SP timer and runs as local system. Within SharePoint, there's a timer job status page, and it lets you view what's running and what isn't. And there's also a timer job definition page that gives you options to control the timer jobs. We're actually going to take a look at timer jobs and the service account management that we talked about in the next demonstration, which is right now. We'll actually enable single sign-on as well. So back into my application sharing. Can we see it?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so here I am back on my page where we launched that job, or at least the test for the job. Let me refresh this page here and see what the status is. Oh, good, test succeeded. That's always good to see. Nice green text there. All right, so let's go back to our main operations page. And for the sake of managing our timer jobs, we're going to be going under our global configuration area. And notice we have the timer job definitions. Notice we have both definitions and status. Let's first take a look at the definitions of the timer jobs. And this actually allows us some flexibility in managing these. We notice we can see the jobs as they're defined here, the web application that they're associated with, the type of schedule that is then associated with those jobs, whether hourly, daily, and so on, or by the minute. We can do some modification of these jobs, in particular the definition of the job, I should say. So for example, I have a couple of them that are listed as change log, but maybe I want to change the title a little bit here so that I can recognize this one as being the change log for litware. Notice we can also disable timer jobs from this. So notice there's our change log for litware Inc. Now another timer job is the timer job status. And these are the same jobs. Notice I'm going to go back to my operations page here. And this time go to the timer job status under global configuration. Now these are the same jobs that were listed in the previous list. And both of these changes allow you actually have the ability to filter the jobs so that you only view the information that's relevant. So here I'm listing all of the jobs and their current status, whether they've succeeded, what server they run on, what the progress is, and so on, when they were last started. But if I need to, if this list grows pretty large, I can actually choose to view just the services or just the web applications, jobs that are associated with web applications. So it helps us to narrow the search down, actually target what we're looking for. Now another thing I mentioned in terms of security and the security configuration is the ability to configure how services are started and what authentication services use. That's often a tricky prospect in applications that have a number of services running and they have to be running in a particular context for the sake of authentication and security. So back on my authentication, or operations tab, I should say, and under security configuration, I have the ability to manage my service accounts. So we click on this, and this gives us the ability to modify or manage the credentials, either for a Windows service, so we can click that down and list the ones that are relevant to this application, or by web application pool. And in this case, I can drill down. Well, what web application am I talking about? Windows SharePoint Services, a particular pool, maybe the moss.litwareinc.com, and it knows from that that this is currently configured to use the Litware Inc. administrator username, but we could change that at this point, and that's the whole point. We can change and manage the credentials that are being used for these particular services or web application pools. So if I wanted to, or if I had a password change I needed to enter here, this is where I would do it. Click OK. Brings us back to the operations page. Now, I talked about single sign-on. We want to enable single sign-on. Now, by default, the single sign-on service is not started. The single sign-on service is actually called the Microsoft Single Sign-On Service. And to actually use it, we need to go into the services list. And let's go ahead and expand that a little bit here. And scroll down to Microsoft Single Sign-On Service. There it is. Notice that it's not started by default. Now, you may choose to change the startup type for this service and make sure that it automatically starts on your server should you choose to use this. I'm going to go ahead and start the service. Another thing also to notice, I've associated an account that's within the Litware Inc. domain. In this case, it is the administrator account. You would probably choose some other account to use here, some account that was designated just for this purpose. But it's important to note what domain this account resides in, and I'll talk about why in just a second. So let's go ahead and start the service. Close out of that. And now we'll go back to our operations page, and in order to manage the settings for single sign-on, I click on, under Security Configuration, Manage Settings for Single Sign-On. So we've started the service, we're in the management, and the first thing we want to do, and notice the rest of it is all disabled, we first have to manage our server settings. So this is where we specify the SSO administrator account. This is going to be the name or of the group or the user account that can, or the user account that can set up and manage the SSO service. Now, an important note here: this account must be a member of the same domain to which the single sign-on service account belongs. That's why I made note of the Litware Inc. domain. So I'm going to add that here. I'm also going to copy that because that's also I'm going to use as the Enterprise Application Definition Administrator or account. So this is a group or user account that can set up and manage the application definitions. And again, this has to be the same domain as the single sign-on service. It's already found some database settings for me. It's found the server name. It's going to create a database on the server called SSO. Now this is my SQL server in this case. In fact, notice I have SQL Server Management Studio currently open. I don't yet have an SSO database on this server. Once I'm done with this page, though, we're going to get a new database that manages our single sign-on credentials, and that's the SSO database. We can set the timeout settings. So this is the number of minutes to wait to allow for a ticket to timeout. And again, depending on your needs, perhaps you want to increase or decrease that timeout. We can enter the number of days to hold records in the audit log before we delete them, so we could raise or lower that value as well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and it's going to build a database for me. And actually, I can even go back to SQL Server Management Studio. We'll go ahead and refresh this view, and notice there's now a SSO database. So now it brought us back to our managed settings for single sign-on for our server, and notice we have these now other options available to us. Now, one of the things that you may want to set up, or be aware of at least, is the fact that we have an encryption key that was generated for us. And this encryption key is then how all credentials are encrypted and managed and stored securely in the SQL Server. And it's associated then with the credentials. So we can regenerate this key. If I click on Manage Encryption Key, we can perhaps we have a policy at our company to change this key after a certain amount of time, just for security's sake. So we have the ability to very easily create an encryption key, or regenerate a new key, essentially, and then make sure that once you do that, that you re-encrypt all the credentials when you do that. So let's go ahead and allow that to happen. And then third thing to consider here as well is the fact that we do have this key that is important to us. We may want to back it up. And so it's going to ask us to choose some external or removable media. Now the only removable media I have here that my server recognizes is a floppy drive apparently. But we would choose then some removable media to save that to, and in turn then if we needed to restore it, we would bring it from that removable media. Very important that you store this in a very secure location. All right. Let's go back to our managing settings for single sign-on here. And now I'm going to talk about the enterprise application definition settings. Because single sign-on is only as good as having applications on the back end that we're actually using this functionality for in order to gain authentication to those applications. So you'll manage, first of all, the settings for this. And we'll create a new item on this page. It's essentially a new enterprise application definition. And we would then essentially create this this item that we would use to associate with an application. So we could give, in this case, the name that appears to the users for the sake of this application. And the application's name. And then some contact email address, someone that the users can contact for this application. And then you select the account type. Now the account type it really has to do with then how is the authentication going to be happening to this application. So you'll select group if you want to connect to the enterprise application with the same account for all users. So all users essentially using the same authentication to a particular application. You'll select individual if you want everyone to have their own unique authentication, a different account for each user, or you'll choose group with a strict restricted account option, and this is going to connect to the enterprise application with a single privileged account for all users. Only server components that perform additional security policy enforcement after the data is retrieved would be able to use a restricted account. So I'm going to go ahead and allow group in this case. We would turn on Windows authentication. And then this is the sort of information that we'll be asking the user for the sake of single sign-on. So it actually gives us essentially the fields that are being mapped to particular information. So the first one being username, and then will be whether or not we mask that field. So we prompt the user for a username and for a password. Notice the password field, yes, is masked. Yes is checked here. So the users will not be able to see the password, or more importantly, someone over their shoulder will be able to see their password as they're typing it in. And we can add additional fields here as well. Okay, so there's our just a basic example of an application definition. All right. Now let's talk about disasters. It's going to happen, right? Someone's going to delete something, and they're going to come to you, and they want it back. Well, a beautiful thing in SharePoint Server 2003 is that we now have something as simple as a recycle bin. So this is a brand new functionality. It's very similar in some ways to the Windows recycle bin. Essentially, it gives you an extra stage of file retrieval. But in this case, in the case of the recycle bin here, it's actually 2 stages of file retrieval. So the first stage is what you expect. When an item is deleted, it's removed from a particular list or whatever you deleted it from, and it's placed into the user's recycle bin. So on the recycle bin page, the user has the option then to restore or permanently delete any item. So they can restore the document. It'll simply move it back into the original location. You also, as a site collection administrator, you have the option to automatically permanently delete items that have been in the recycle bin for a specific amount of time. So you can actually set a timeout on recycle bin items. Now there's another stage to the recycle bin here. In this case, this is the recycle bin storing items that users have deleted from their recycle bin for later restoration when needed. So essentially, it's a second recycle bin. It's a recycle bin for recycle bin items that have been removed from the first recycle bin. Now this second stage actually does add to space requirements, as you can imagine. You can enlarge this recycle bin to a specific percentage, and when you enable that second stage recycle bin for web application, you need to designate how much disk space is available to that second stage recycle bin, and it's as a percentage of the quota that's allotted to the web application. If you recall, when we created a web application in part 1, we had a quota that we could assign to the web application for how much space it would use. And this is a portion of that quota. Now you can allocate up to 1,000% actually of the quota. So the second stage quota can actually be 10 times the size of the quota that you've reserved for the application. The STS admin utility. This is another utility that we can use for disaster recovery. It's a simple backup. It backs up my sites and divisional site collections in a single server farm configuration. So you can use this utility to back up your sites, your my sites, your site collections, and you can restore site collections without having to overwrite all of the portal databases. You can back up an entire divisional site collection and all of the sites that are contained beneath it. Now, one thing you can't do with this tool is you can't use it to back up an individual subsite. But you can restore content and subsites within a site collection by restoring the site collection to a different site. And then you would manually copy the lost data to the original location. The backup file includes subsites, pages in the sites, files in the document libraries or lists, security and permission settings, feature settings. And you should also note that using the STS admin backup and using it in a script does affect performance on the server farm. So the backup process is going to take up memory and processing power. So if you choose to schedule a backup in a script, you might want to schedule it to a time when the server farm is less used. Maybe the usage is light, maybe in the evening. There are more disaster recovery methods that you can choose from. Mirrors or failover farm involves replication of the primary farm onto a secondary system. So in this situation, you may be using SQL Server log shipping transfers. Log shipping transferring the content database data. And it's important to note in log shipping or in SQL Server 2005 in the mirror configuration, it's only the content databases that can actually be mirrored in such a way that they can be brought online immediately when the first mirror fails over. You still need to consider the configuration data and so on. You can mirror it, but you have to do a manual step in order to bring the secondary mirror online should the first mirror fail. Another option that you have, again, in large organizations, many of you that have off-site data centers, you probably already are using SQL Server tools and maybe you're choosing then to use SQL Server for the sake of backup and restore. So you have that person that's responsible for the databases, the database administrator. Regardless of what application it is, it's going to be the database administrator rather than your SharePoint central administrator that's going to be doing the backups for you. So SQL Server Backup can back up your databases. It can allow you to schedule backup tasks. It provides backup logs for the administrator to review whether or not jobs were successful or had failed. And then finally, there is a built-in SharePoint Backup Restore utility that you can use. Very simple off-the-SharePoint Server backup utility. So that said and that described, let's actually show you what some of those options look like in SharePoint Server in our last demonstration here. Okay, so for this one I'm going to go back to my Operations tab, an Operations area. And to work with backup and restore, well, we have a backup and restore area. So the first thing I'm going to click on here, we're just going to take advantage, first of all, of SharePoint and actually use it to perform our backup. So notice on this farm, our one farm that we're managing here, I have the entire farm listed here, and we can actually choose the different components that we want to back up, the different web applications, different content databases, our shared services can be backed up, and we can choose as much or as little of this set of information as we want. Now let's say I want to back up the whole farm. I'll just click on Farm, selects everything for me. Terrific. And we'll go ahead and start the backup process. Now by start the backup process is really going to ask us one more question here, and that is, first of all, what type of backup are we going to perform? Is this a full backup where we're backing up all of our content with all history, or is it simply a differential backup where we're only backing up just the changes that have happened since the last full backup occurred? Now, in this case, I'll go ahead and do a full backup of my entire farm, and I'll choose a backup location as well. I happen to have a folder set up for this, but you probably choose some other media or some other location. Let's go ahead and use my SharePoint backup folder that I created. In fact, let me just copy that because I'm going to open up that folder to show you what the backup looks like. So let's go ahead and quickly open up a Windows Explorer into that location. Nothing there currently. Nothing up my sleeve. Click OK. And now it's actually launched the backup. Now actually, well, it hasn't launched the backup just yet. It sometimes takes a couple minutes to launch the job. But once it does, this page can be refreshed. I'll hit refresh right now. Nope, nothing yet. Eventually, we're going to see some status on the job. We'll see what's going on, what's backed up, what it has yet to back up, and so on. So while we're waiting for that to happen, let me show you another backup option that we have, and this was the command line backup using the stsadmin command. Now I've already opened up a command prompt here, and I've launched the stsadmin.exe with the /help and then backup in order to get the help information regarding how the backup operation works. And notice in this, oh, look at that. We actually have some status here. So we have some progress going on right now. Currently, some of the items are in the process of backing up. Some are simply being prepared to back up. So that's going to update for us in just a minute. Okay, so using the command line backup, we can do a site collection backup, or we can do a full backup with this tool. This is really the two options that we have. Now, of course, a site collection backup takes considerably less time than a full backup, so I'm going to go ahead and use the stsadmin, the operation backup, and the application or URL I'm going to back up. And the file name I'm going to be backing it up to I'm going to put a backup. The file name is going to be called backup that I'm going to be using. I'll just put this file called backup in that SharePoint backup folder. And let's also say that we're going to overwrite if there are any previously existing backups. So I'll hit enter, and it will start the backup for me. Now let's take a look at that SharePoint backup. Here are the files that are generated. Oh, look at that. My content backup is already completed successfully. So I haven't had not much content on this empty site here. But notice it's created this backup file for me, and that was the backup that we created with the STS-ADM file, the executable. Here are the files that were created by the SharePoint backup. And notice also, talking again about the SharePoint backup, let's go back to the Operations tab here. And we can look at the backup and restore history. We can restore from backup, and this will bring us to a page where we choose the location where the backup was, and we can easily pull from that to do a restore. And the last option I mentioned was SQL Server, using SQL Server as your backup engine for those of you in larger organizations that have a DBA responsible for these databases that are being managed here. So let's say, for example, for the configuration information in SharePoint, very easy to use the tasks within the SQL Server Management Studio and simply back up a database or more. Certainly you would probably end up creating tasks in order to do this automatically for you. But it is easy to do manually. I'll go ahead and just use the default source, or the sources being the SharePoint config and then default backup set. Completed successfully. Okay, so to summarize what we talked about today in our session, we discussed the options that you have for deploying Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007. We talked about how you need to fit those choices into what your organization needs. And the whole idea, of course, is to reduce total cost of ownership. You're going to be achieving simplicity, consistency, and extensibility by carefully deploying your SharePoint Server installation. We talked about how we've streamlined the deployment of SharePoint. We allow for easier administration, and we talked about the many different things that you would want to configure. We talked about some of the advanced configurations, such as the extranet support and URL translations that SharePoint does for you. We talked about single sign-on configuration, content paths and jobs and how they're configured, what timer jobs are for and how you can manage those and watch and report on those. And then the backup operations. We talked a little bit about disaster recovery. I have some additional resources for you here as well. Certainly as IT professionals, the best first place to go for information from Microsoft is Microsoft.com/technet. If you are interested in resources just on this session, I have this resource page. The official content page for this site is here, Microsoft.com/technet and then DSK102. However, I mentioned already that on my blog, I have also posted a resource page, and here's the permalink to that resource page at my blog for some additional links of information. I'm also a member of the Microsoft Across America teams I mentioned earlier, and we do live events. We go all over the country delivering live events for IT professionals under the TechNet Event brand. So if you go to technetevents.com, you can find out more information about the events that we're doing this coming quarter. Of course, right now we're in the midst of our launch of Windows Vista and Office 2007 and Exchange Server 2007. So we have some great content around those products that you can see right now. And as I mentioned too, as a last resort, if you don't find the answers in any of the links that I provided you, then certainly don't hesitate to send me an email, kevinremdy@microsoft.com. I want to take an opportunity to thank you very much for attending the webcast today. I'm going to take a look at the question and answer queue to see if we have any questions there. It looks like we have a couple. So while I'm taking a look at those, feel free to enter some more if you have any additional questions, and I will address those as I can. And then the ones that I can't address, I'll certainly post the answers to those on my blog as well.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. I am going to put up the survey here. I encourage you all to fill it out. As a little incentive to filling it out, by attending this live webcast and submitting the evaluation, you will be entered to win a 30 gigabyte Zune digital media player. So I'm going to put the survey up and give you a chance to fill it out. You'll notice there are two options. Registered online and all of the registrants. Please select the one that applies to you. And yeah, Kevin, it looks like we have a number of questions in the queue. We are just about out of time, but I want to give you some some time to answer those verbally if there are a couple of them you could get to.
Sure, you bet.
Yeah.
I did get one question about where I can find more information on how to configure my sites. And you're welcome. Thank you. And I'm going to actually post that link in my blog, but I want to make sure that I get that in the Q&A log here so that I address this, because I do post these in my blog, and you can find more information there. Can we schedule a job for this backup? And I assume that the question is referring to using the SharePoint backup and scheduling a job through there. You know, I don't know the answer to that question. I would assume that you should be able to schedule jobs that in turn launch processes, and the process could either be one of the timer jobs as defined, but you'd have to have defined the job that launches the backup, or probably more likely launching the STS ADM on the back end. So you certainly can use a script and use a task scheduled command in order to use the STS ADM to schedule your backups. But I would have to look into further other options for scheduling within SharePoint. That's an excellent question. Thank you. Does STS ADM also back up databases to the backup directory, or SQL Server databases backup supplements it? Do you need either of them or both? I would say either of them. You're not required to use one or the other. STS admin will actually pull the data essentially from SharePoint and back it up for you. And by pulling data from SharePoint, I mean essentially pulling it from SQL Server. So you really don't have to know or care the fact that the data is actually managed for your live information in a SQL Server database. You're backing it up into another location, so it's pulling it from SQL and putting it into this separate file. So you can really use either. And using the SQL database backup on the back end, of course, gives you more flexibility. And typically in larger organizations, you have a database administrator that's responsible for that responsible for that data anyway. So you want them to be in control of that. Let's see. We're getting another question here. I have a WSS 2.0 server with many sites. If I do an in-place upgrade to Windows SharePoint Server Services 3.0 and MOS 2007, will all my existing URLs be broken, or will they still work, or what? There are probably some. I can't say that 100% of the time it's going to work for you, and there are probably some. There are some considerations in terms of the way you've defined things. So I can't just say that it's going to be a direct one installation is going to fix all the problems. It does depend on whether you're going directly to Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 or if you're jumping directly to MOS, which is kind of built on top of Windows SharePoint Services, although it is a separate install that installs both. So I would have to. I'm going to look at and on my blog I will post in answer to this question a link to the resources for migration and what options that you have. I believe I actually did post that on the question and answers from the previous webcast as well, from part 1. Then Tim asks, should... oh, okay, that sounds to be a comment. Yeah, somebody, I think, responding to the previous question about the backup and being able to schedule it, and someone commented, yes, you should be able to create a scheduled task using the command line backup. No, that's right. And the final question, does MOS 2007, and by final question I mean don't stop writing. If you're writing a question, feel free to do that. I will answer it in text, or I will make sure that the answer to that is also on my blog. The final question I'll answer here, since we're a few minutes over, does MOS 2007 support CSS tableless layouts, or could you provide a resource to review? I will look into that further. I haven't worked deeply with CSS and how the look and feel can be managed through that. I know that the SharePoint Designer tool is a very good tool, part of the Office suite now, that allows you to do much of this that management and being able to really nicely customize the look and feel of your pages. But how that works beneath the covers is not my area, unfortunately. So I will provide you a resource for that. Well, great. Thank you all very much for some wonderful questions, and I also want to thank you in advance for filling out the evaluation today. We appreciate your feedback. I do sincerely hope you found something useful today and that you'll look into deploying Office SharePoint Server further.
Okay, I do want to thank Kevin Remdy for presenting today. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webcast. That concludes today's TechNet webcast. You may now disconnect from the audio portion of this conference.